legalizefreedom.com.
Good evening. I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com, and today I want to talk about some of the social, cultural, but particularly psychological effects and side effects of the measures taken in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, so-called COVID-19. Now, for this I'm thinking of social distancing, self-isolation or isolation in general, and the wearing of masks, and all of the associated measures that have been implemented in varying degrees around the world by governments and institutions. Now, I feel that these are going to have profound impacts. They're already having profound impacts on our society as a whole, and this is only going to increase going forward, particularly if these measures persist and events are rather leaning in that direction. Now, before I say anything further, it does not matter what your perspective is in all this about the pandemic. That's to say, whether you think that the pandemic has been deliberately engineered or deliberately released and is basically one huge social engineering program in order to make sweeping changes to society, or on the other hand, whether you think that it is entirely natural, an act of nature, an act of God. We've had pandemics before. This is just the latest one. It seems particularly virulent, and governments worldwide have had to take steps, invasive steps, to do something about it. Whether your position is anywhere between those two poles doesn't actually matter in what I'm going to say, because whether you're in favor of them or not, these measures are going to have, and say, are already having huge impacts. Now, whether this is anything really to worry about does seem to be somewhat affected by where you sit on that spectrum. People who are very worried about this quite often feel that no matter what the origin of the pandemic, whether it was deliberately engineered or whether it's a natural event, that the wake of it is being used for sweeping social change. And that's how I feel about it. That seems to be where the evidence is pointing. Some people who see any and all of that as conspiracy theories, they seem to feel, in my experience, that the fallout from these measures, the social distancing and the isolation and mask wearing and all of that, is nothing really to worry about. It's a passing thing, and it's, there's problems with it now, but people just need to get over themselves. And any talk of long-lasting psychological effects is just wild exaggeration. You hear this summed up when people sort of saying, you just have to do this for a while. You just have to do that. Things are a bit more inconvenient now for a little bit. Nothing to worry about. So that seems to be how people's opinions divide along those lines. But to stress that the problems caused by these apparently so-called preventative measures is just economic, I think is incredibly naive. Now, there are psychological, social and cultural fallouts from the economic impacts. Of course, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, family members dying, whatnot. There's huge impacts from those. But I'm really talking about the more subtle ones, or perhaps not so subtle, from doing things that ostensibly don't appear to do us any immediate harm. And that's what I'm concerned about. I'm not at all sure that there has been a lot written about these harms, but I'm not sure it's been taken into account when governments, for example, in the US or here in the UK, yo-yo with introducing and withdrawing and changing all of these measures on a seemingly day-to-day basis. One thing that these measures have done is to exacerbate existing trends. Now, I spoke quite a lot about this in my recent video, COVID-19, the Great Reset, how there were economic changes underway, environmental changes happening, and the wake of the pandemic has exacerbated those shifts. I think that the social changes that we've seen in the late 20th, early 21st century around technology in particular, I think are going to be massively amplified by this crisis, and to say the fallout from these measures. People spending time on their own, engaging with technology, for whether it's working from home or whether it's not having a job, basically spending a lot of time on their own, indoors, away from other people, away from nature, and relying on a virtual existence. And we've seen these multiply massively in the last few months. On a more human level, one of the things I think that people found most difficult to deal with, like on day one or week one of these measures when they were introduced into your country, was simple things that we do without thinking, like hugging someone, kissing someone, shaking someone's hand. And the last time I remember clearly, the last time I shook someone's hand, and it was on March 16th, 2020, and as I was doing it, the guy said to me, I'd never met him before, he said, "We're not supposed to be doing this, are we?" And he laughed nervously, and that was March 16th. It's not that I haven't wanted to do it since then, but I, like most people, have self-consciously been avoiding it, not because I won't shake anyone's hand, but now it's almost seen as offensive. A cultural faux pas that, for example, when Westerners travel to Islamic countries or to the Far East, whatever, quite often it's very easy to get yourself in difficulties socially if you don't know what the rules are. So it seems that our rules, long established and very natural rules as I see it, for human beings to touch each other, embrace each other, those have been upended, suspended. We'll see if, how, when, what shape that will take, if any of that returns. But no physical contact. We know this. It stands to reason. It's common sense. We may have experienced it ourselves, periods of loneliness, cut off from other people, and isolation. And not having physical contact is very, very deleterious to human beings, particularly in terms of their development. So, for example, it's well documented problems that children can have as they grow up if they have suffered from a lack of physical contact when they were young. It can make them very needy. It can lead to, when I say needy, I mean in an exaggerated way. It can create dysfunctional relationships for them later in life. It can cause addictions and all sorts of other psychological problems. This affects, in particular, there's a lot spoken about with this virus in terms of how it affects the elderly in particular, because they're physically the most vulnerable. But the psychological, social and cultural impacts of these measures affects old people also disproportionately, because they're quite often already isolated and lonely. This is a well-known cultural and social phenomenon, and it leads to misery, illness, and premature death, probably millions of times every year. And again, these impacts have been massively exaggerated by the actions in the wake of the crisis. You may, listening to this, be aware of family members who are in this position, suffering in this way. And it's just part of the reason that I was going to say I think, but I know that the negative destructive impacts of the measures taken to combat the coronavirus pandemic far outweigh any benefit gained in terms of saving lives. The preventative so-called actions will have destroyed many more lives, including killing people, than could ever have been saved in these steps to control a virus, which is widely known is survivable by the vast majority of people, no matter what age group they're in. And even if they're already ill, it's still more likely than not that you will survive, depending on what your other comorbidity is. This has a huge effect on young people as well. Again, disproportionately to, say, someone in my age group or in their 30s. Because they're so reliant on social interaction and contact in their developing lives, particularly children once they get a bit more independence, once they're able to spend time, maybe not with their parents, but with other friends' parents and in social groups. Once they start going to school, and particularly once they get into their teenage years, social interaction is so important. And we've seen this manifest in what many people have called irresponsible actions by teenagers, gathering together in groups and just really struggling to abide to lockdown mandates. And this is simply because they fear social isolation more than any virus. And statistically, they're correct to take that position. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not saying they're right or wrong in what they're doing. It's not an excuse. It's a reason. It's a reason why they're doing what they're doing. Other things that have started to make life very bizarre are the lack of contact with surfaces, not able to touch anything. And this has led to all sorts of bizarre Byzantine arrangements in public places so that we don't have to touch anything. And of course, when you stop touching things, it's only then that you realize how often you do touch things. Light switches, door handles, flusher on the toilet. You pick things up in shops, you pick things up everywhere you're out and about. It's very, very common. And again, this is inhibiting people's lives in ways that, we're starting to resemble a world of obsessive compulsive disorder sufferers. And I feel, again, that we're probably going to see a lot of mental illness along these lines continue if any of this is ever declared over. The mask wearing dimension of this, I know, is a very hot topic. It's controversial. It's a lot of people are get very emotional, get very agitated, get very angry when discussing this, whether they're in favor of mask wearing and see it as absolutely essential to combating the virus, or whether they're absolutely pitched against it for whatever the reasons happen to be, whether they take a conspiratorial view of the pandemic, or whether they just are, as I'm concerned, more with just the cultural, social, and psychological impact of it. What does this do to us? The main thing is further inhibition of social interaction. And as the virus seems to be going down, declining as a problem, so mask wearing has been ramped up and more emphasized. And that's probably the single biggest psychological, social problem in all of this, is not being able to see people's facial expression. Never mind the millions of people who are deaf or hard of hearing. I mean, imagine being one of those now in a social situation, or even just in public, surrounded by hundreds and thousands of people, and just silence. You can't be any part of that group anymore unless it's in a very structured, deliberate way that you speak one-on-one with someone or a group and they remove their masks or whatever. They make efforts to make themselves understood. Otherwise, the world has just become an even quieter place for people like that. But just individuals in general, as social creatures, this has enormous impacts. It really does. It has strange, not maybe counterintuitive, but strange impacts that you wouldn't necessarily think of straight away. It makes us more compliant. But it's also an inhibitor for behavior. So it can make some people more likely to commit a crime or act negatively in some way, what would be considered negatively, quite simply because they become anonymous up to a point. And there's a rich irony in all of the camera surveillance that's been introduced over the last few decades. And there were many places, including banks. I don't know what the rules are like at the moment, but many places like banks and other public places that you couldn't go into if you were wearing a crash helmet. And there was all the controversy about burqas. We can't see who this is. Lots of terrorists have dressed themselves up in burqas in order to disguise their identity and indeed hide their bombs. Now it's mandated you must hide your identity. People don't maybe see it as hiding your identity, but that's what it is. Other things that have gone out the window: sharing amongst, if you're outside of your social bubble or your rule of six or whatever the hell it is this week, sharing anything becomes difficult. In a workplace, nobody puts a bag of cookies on the staff room table anymore for people just to have. I brought these in for everybody. That doesn't happen anymore. Kids used to take sweets to school for the same reasons. Giving of gifts, I guess, is not really happening anymore, particularly spontaneously, doing any of this without prior planning. And that echoes the way all of our interactions, and particularly commercial activity on our part, whether it's business or whether it's shopping, dining, entertainment, all of it now has become very, very structured and controlled. It has to be planned in advance. So overall, the spontaneity and a lot of the joy actually has gone out of just everyday life. And this is compounded by the fact that nobody's smiling anymore. They are, of course, but you can't tell. You can't tell. And the masks also make people just less likely to speak and less likely to interact. A lot of people find it difficult to breathe and those things, so they just don't put any effort into anything that might require them to have to breathe, put a bit more effort into breathing. Speaking is one of those things. Another curious thing that I have not heard anyone address, but it is a side effect of mask wearing, is what does the dating scene look like now? Obviously, you can go to a bar, by arrangement, of course. You can go to a bar, take off your mask, have a drink with perhaps a stranger that you've met online, that you perhaps, go out on a date with, see you're looking to form a relationship. But all of the spontaneous ways of doing that, you meet someone at work, you meet someone in the street, you meet someone at an event. A lot of human relationships of all sorts start that way, including lifelong romantic and loving relationships begin that way. And again, I hear people say, yeah, well, this is all temporary. Maybe so. Let's wait and see. Looking back to what I was saying about children and their development, all of these measures taken together over time, particularly if they persist for a long period, what sort of adults does that make? Whether you're a young child now, having your pattern of development interrupted by all of these measures, or whether you're not aware of the world, you're very young and you're not aware of the world or anything that's going on, but if it's possible that you might grow up, imagine this lasts for years. So the question is, what sort of adults does that make? Because we see adults now, fully grown human beings, being scarred for life as a result of the social, cultural, and psychological fallout of these measures. So if that occurs, if these are brought to bear earlier in your development, before you're fully developed, then what sort of adults do we get? How fearful, how compliant, how locked down emotionally is an adult going to be is if all these things that are going on now, the way that we're interacting or failing to, the way we're living or failing to, if that persists. Which is entirely possible, because I don't hear very many people speaking about a way out of this. And that's a key point, actually. What's the end game here? And if anybody hears any public figure, particularly politicians or not business people, because they're constantly talking about a way out of this, but any senior politicians anywhere in the world who've got a plan for how to unravel this unholy mess, do drop me a line. I'd like to know about it. I've spoken before about the public arena and how all of that is affected by these measures. Talking about politicians, of course, We've all seen the protests that have gone on around the world, Black Lives Matter being probably the most prominent example. But we've also seen anti-lockdown protests which have been violently shut down. So again, in the name of these measures, you can't gather in large groups. What effect does that have for political life? Not just protests, but even elections. We've got election cycle now happening in the US as I speak. This is October 2020. And that's been profoundly affected and will be by all of these measures. A lot of mail-in ballots are being instituted. There are huge problems with security and reliability around those. So, and again, if this carries on, that's going to be something we have to factor in. Another big part of life, particularly in America, but it's significant in many parts of the world, is religious life. That's been profoundly affected. Churches in this country, presumably in the US, and other religious, I can't speak for Islamic countries or in Israel, for example, how they're coping. I think the measures are very draconian, but I'm not sure how the religious life has been affected. But certainly weddings, christenings, funerals, those markers in life that quite often the church has traditionally had a role in, all of those have been profoundly affected. And I wonder, given that church attendance was already under enormous pressure, had dwindled massively in the West during the 20th and early 21st century, what that will look like going forward. Because even those people who wouldn't normally consider themselves churchgoers, who reached out to religious institutions at a time of crisis, which this has been for many people, found not much, really. Silence, locked doors. So is that a pattern for the future? Other mass events that have been affected, anything to do with live entertainment, obviously, but other gatherings, cinema, theatre. This is something that I'm not going to dwell on now as far as how social distancing and mask wearing and whatnot may affect that. I'm going to do something separately on that topic. Going back to young people again, of course, school life has been enormously affected. This is another thing that I think is already having huge effects. And we're going to see, never mind my previous point about what sort of adults does all this make, we're going to see educationally impacts from this. I'm convinced throughout people's lives, people now in school, unless they find themselves right at the end of school, perhaps in university, they've received most of their formal education. Maybe they can progress from here relatively unscarred. But the intervention in schools, the social distancing and mask wearing and whatnot, which is wholly unnecessary really, has been massively destructive. And it's one of the things that I personally find most distressing in all of this is hearing from people with young children in school and those that are struggling to deal with it, just the state that they're in mentally and emotionally. Listening to parents speak about it, it's horrible, absolutely horrible to listen to. And I know people will say, well, it's a necessary evil. It's just a side effect of all this. Well, that's what I'd like us to question a bit more going forward. John Rappaport, the investigative reporter, actually did, thinking about religion now, did quite a funny piece recently. It's set in, I think, the year 3000, and it's about how the dimensions of this that appear quite obsessive, which I mentioned earlier, become religious over time. And in the year 3000, there's the Church of COVID, and there's ritual hand washing, which is a religious thing anyway in some cultures. And just all of these actions that I'm speaking about today, how they persist into the far future, and they become, no one can remember the origin of them, but it's the Church of COVID. This is what we do, and a long time ago, something happened, and the church came into being, and we don't know why we're doing these things, but it's the law, it's the Bible, it's what we do, and it's what gives us meaning in life. We wash our hands on the hour, and I know that ritual washing, as I said, is an Islamic practice, as far as I know. We wash our hands every hour, and we cleanse the surfaces once a day, at 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening, and we drink bleach on Sunday, whatever it happens to be. And on that note, a religious note, I did a video recently which was narrating a piece by another author. The the dystopian age of the mask. And in that, I talk about the proximity of our societies at the minute, how they're moving into the territory currently occupied or previously occupied by classic dystopias, 1984, Brave New World, all of that. And in the terminology, which I address in another video called Words Are Weapons, Don't Hex Yourself, we're now swimming in a sea of Orwellian oxymorons, really, social distancing being the classic one. And that's why I've called the video Anti-Social Distancing, because that's what it actually is. You can say, oh yeah, but it's a social thing to distance. Well, no, it's not. It is actually antisocial. Just call it distancing, you know. Call it distancing, but not social distancing, please. The other trend that I have mentioned this previously that's been exacerbated in all this is that the one I spoke about, you know, engaging with tech and staying at home. That's something I think that we know is going to be a huge part of the future, with potentially very negative outcomes, because whatever happens with the virus or the pandemic, commercial property was a car crash before any of this happened in any event. But businesses have now discovered, or are discovering, that these big buildings that they've got are actually surplus to requirements. So home working, which was a trend anyway, and a lot of people expressed a desire to do so. A lot more people, of course, are struggling to adapt to it, but that is the wave of the future, as I see it. And that is going to mean that if we want to avoid self-isolating, just as a matter of course, we'll have to make an effort to socialize. And for a lot of people, it's going to take a long time, whether they want to or not, a long time to get back to anything like normal on that front, given the measures I'm talking about, and if they persist. And I also wonder, as I'm basically coming to a conclusion, what all of this isolation and distancing and mask wearing does for the cohesion of a society. Now, we've seen in America where cohesion was a sort of big social problem prior to all this, how they have dealt particularly badly with the pandemic and its aftermath. Well, we're in the middle of it right now, but dealt with the fallout from it. America looks like a society basically falling apart. But in other societies that are relatively cohesive, that may help them get through this, but they've also driven a wedge into the heart of their society with these measures. And there's been a lot of talk about blitz spirit and people coming together in a crisis, but the evidence is, it's out there, that has not happened. The opposite has happened. We've become more fearful, more divided, less likely to help other people because of these measures and because of fear of infection and all the rest of it. Somebody said to me not that long ago, they were very pro these distancing and health safety measures, that they would wear a hazmat suit. That's one of those full body radiation suits or chemical warfare suits, something like that. They would wear a hazmat suit to the grocery store if it would save one life. Now, there's a very simple comeback on that, which is because I think that's a bit extreme, frankly. Okay, so my question then is, and this is addressed to everybody, is there anything, ask yourself this, is there anything in the name of this that you would not do? I'll suggest something to give you an idea of what I'm thinking of. Would you kill yourself to save the life of one random stranger? Now, I'd imagine for most people, the answer to that would be no. I'm not talking about sacrificing your life for a loved one, your husband or wife or child. Lots of people would do that. It has happened. But would you give up your life to save the life of one random stranger? So probably not. So between wearing a hazmat suit to buy bread and milk to killing yourself to save one random life, in that, what wouldn't you do? What's the line? If you think I'm being ridiculous talking about suicide, what is the line then? Okay, so you'd wear a hazmat suit to the grocery store. What would you not do? Just have a think about that, and then remind yourself of that thought when the moment comes, as it probably will, when you'll have to ask yourself, is this my line in the sand? Is this a red line? Am I going to cross this Rubicon? More on this, I mentioned the video earlier that I did recently, COVID-19, The Great Reset. You can find that on YouTube along with all the other videos that I name checked. Some fellow travelers out there in alternative media have done some good work on this recently. Thinking of people like Thomas Sheridan. He's got a YouTube channel, more than one actually. He's been a guest on Legalized Freedom many times. Bjorn Andreas Bull Hansen, He, again, very prominent YouTuber, done some great work on all of this. Christian Morris, a recent guest of mine on Legalized Freedom, also on YouTube, and also a fellow called Niall Murphy. He goes under the handle of Mr. Opaque Lens on YouTube. Check those guys out. Between them, they've got a lot of material and a lot of great insights and thoughts on what we're currently living through or not living through. Yeah, it seems to be the clarion call, doesn't it? Stop living, save lives. I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizedfreedom.com.
legalizedfreedom.com